Hello viewers and a warm welcome to the show today. I'm your host Chef Andy, and today we're going to be working around chapatis. I'm also going to be showing you some beautiful techniques of enriching your flour, and of course some beautiful tips as well of serving, and of course different techniques of cooking. But before we begin, I'll begin by introducing the name of the dish. So we're going to be making chapati chips. Very simple recipe. But before we begin, a tour of the ingredients before us, just to give you an idea of what to expect. Now from the very front, you'll require 3 tablespoons of vinegar, 2 tablespoons of regular sugar, 1 red bullet chili, and about 3 or 4 pieces of green chili. You'll also require some coriander, about a handful. You'll also require some leeks and about half a cup of mango, which has already been chopped, of course. You will also require some all-purpose flour. Measure out about 2 cups for the recipe, and always reserve about 1 cup extra just to be able to dust with. You'll also require some salt for light seasoning, some oil to cook with, and last but not least, some cold water, which of course I've improvised with this very old school kettle. And this is basically to allow us to keep that water nice and cold. Now before we begin, we'll allow you this chance to grab your pens and papers, and we'll catch you after a short break. Welcome back viewers. For those of you who are just catching up, we're right about ready to start our recipe for today, which is chapati chips. Now just before we begin, of course, to mention some of the very important items you'll require, or utensils, for this recipe. So very importantly, have a bowl that you'll be working your dough in. Also be sure to have a plastic or a metallic sieve, stainless steel preferably. This is basically to allow you to sift your flour through. Make sure to remove any unwanted bodies. You'll also require a baking sheet that's already lined with some aluminium foil. And of course, very importantly, a rolling board that you can be able to purchase locally. And you can, of course, alternatively use the kitchen counter, which will, of course, save you the extra cost. Now, to begin the process, very simply, we're going to begin by working our dough. So very important to mention, I'm going to be working with all-purpose flour. Remember, for this particular recipe, you're not looking at raising your dough or your chapati, so you definitely will not need any raising agents. Once your flour is sifted in the bowl, proceed to season very lightly with some salt. And now, very simply, using the fingertips, proceed to work away, mixing your dough, and finish off by making a well. Now this is basically just a nice deep hole right in the center of the bowl. This will always allow you to get a nice, more even mixture. So we're going to begin by adding about 2 tablespoons of some oil. And I'm using vegetable oil for this recipe. You can, of course, use olive oil if you're looking at being a little extravagant. And you can also use some beautiful seasoned oils like sesame oil, which will also give a bit of flavor. Now to that, we will add about half a cup of water to begin with. Remember, very important to mention, always use water in little amounts, especially when working with dough, just to be able to make sure that you don't add too much at the beginning. Now we're going to begin to fold in our dough, beginning by working with the dough right from the sides. So all you're going to do is pretty much cover the mixture right in the center, and you can easily use your fingertips to work through the mixture right up until your water is completely absorbed. And this should take you about 5 to 6 minutes to complete, so do make that reminder on your recipe cards. Right, as you can see, the bowl is almost nice and dry, so very, very important tip to pay attention to, especially just before you begin kneading away your dough. And of course, now we'll bring in some flour. As I mentioned, always reserve some that you'll be using to sift and clean your hands with. So begin by rubbing some on your hands, making sure to remove any bit of the dough that's stuck to your fingers. And of course, dust your hands very, very lightly, and you can proceed to combine the rest of your dough in your bowl. Of course, always working towards forming a ball right at the center of your bowl. You can of course add a bit of flour if your dough is still a little wet. And just proceed to work your dough. Of course, making sure to turn your bowl around as you proceed. And this will always allow for you to get a nice, more even consistency. And you can, of course, use also any particular bowl that you may find, plastic, stainless steel, or glass. Ceramic bowls are also available in the market. And they are particularly very good because they will allow for you to keep your dough nice and cold, especially if you're making any pastry. Just to bring us to the last and final part of our mixing, be sure to remove that from the bowl, and always make sure that your bowl is nice and clean before you finish off. And you can just rub your fingertips around the sides. And what this does is it allows for you to reconstitute any dough that's still stuck to the sides. And finish off by rubbing your hands right over your countertop. And this of course takes us to the second part of the process. Very, very simple. We are going to now start kneading our dough. So begin by reconstituting everything to the center of your work surface. Also proceed to press down your dough onto the little bits of flour that you rubbed off. Remember, those are very much usable, so please don't discard those. And before you proceed, dust your countertop with a bit of flour. And we're basically just going to work our dough first. And you can begin by rolling that to make sure that you squeeze out any air pockets that could be in there. Of course, doing so and incorporating the flour around your surface. You can of course also work around the surface by going round. And this will allow for nice even consistency of your dough, combining of course with the technique of kneading. Right. So your dough should actually be nice and easy to handle now. It should roll off your fingertips very easily. Now we're going to begin to portion this out. So I'm just going to roll it back into shape. Dust a little bit once more. And you can now proceed to portion out your dough. You can alternatively use a sharp knife, or if you do have a pizza cutter, always works quite well. Begin by dusting that a bit and proceed to cut your dough right through the middle. And of course proceed further to portion into 4 equal sized pieces. Very simple. After that, we'll begin by reconstituting your dough right on the surface of your board or your working area. So basically this technique is to bring back the ball into shape. So all I'm going to do is at this stage open my hands around, of course with a little bit of flour on your hand. Always be sure to shake off any excess. And all you're going to do now is roll and take advantage of course of the weight from your hand and the surface. And all you're going to do now is towards the end of the rolling, proceed to open your hand a little, close your hand a little tighter. Of course, keeping your fingertips very open, and that should allow for you to get a nice, beautiful consistency. And what we're looking for is about a golf-size shape. And proceed to do the same for the rest of your pieces. right up until you get to the very end. And for the last and final piece, proceed to do the same. Alright, once those are done, a very short time of rest will allow for you to get a nice, more even, consistent mix. So I'm just going to dust my bowl and proceed to add those in there. And we'll allow those to rest for anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes. Of course, you can proceed to do so and leave them in the refrigerator if you're going to be using them or making them a day in advance. But if you are going to be making them fresh, I will insist, please do not throw them in the fridge. It will actually make your work a little harder to roll. Right, next up, we're going to proceed to prepare the rest of our ingredients. So I'm going to start off by chopping my herbs. Be sure to break off the stems before doing so. Remember, this will particularly be quite chewy inside your dough, so you do want to get rid of them in the beginning stages of your cooking process. Right, using a sharp knife, proceed to chop that as fine as possible. Once that's done, we'll also chop in a bit of some leek. So very simply begin by slicing that lengthways and be sure to open up the stems or the leaves, making sure that there's not any, or rather there's no traces of soil or worms, of course. And we're going to proceed to slice that very thinly. Once you get to the stem bits, proceed to discard those because you're not going to be using them for this recipe. And now very simply, we're going to begin the process by making our dip, which is our mango chutney. So very simple technique I'm going to use. Begin by heating a pan, and to that add a very small dollop of oil. And all you're going to do at this stage is proceed to add in your mangoes. And remember, you will actually allow this to cook off a little bit. Remember, they are going to turn into a little bit of a mushy consistency. And this is particularly a very good technique of getting a beautiful dip, especially for your starters or your snacks. Now, while our mango continues to heat up, just proceed to toss your pan a few times, making sure to coat your mango in some of that oil. And we'll proceed to add 1 tablespoon of sugar and 3 tablespoons of our vinegar. And last but not least, proceed to add your leeks. And at this point in time, we're going to allow this to continue to simmer very gently and undisturbed. Remember, this will take its time to really break down, and of course the onions will take a bit of time to sweat out their juices, infusing our mango chutney very lightly. We'll also proceed to add to that a bit of some red chili. So I'm going to be using bullet chili for this recipe. This is a particularly good chili for using, especially just for flavor. Remember, the bigger the chili, the less the heat. So remember, this is basically just going to give us a bit of flavor. So I'll begin by coring out the bitter center. Now discard. And all I'm going to do is julienne that very quickly. And julienne is basically a cut whereby you slice your vegetables very thinly, almost to the size of a string's thickness. And we'll proceed to add that to your pan and toss just a little bit to get the mixture going. And we'll allow that to continue simmering right up until the liquid is completely absorbed. And of course the mangoes are a little nicer and a little more pureed. Now very simply, we're going to come back to our chapati or our tortilla wrap. Right, now at this stage you can grab a board, or if you prefer you can also work on the countertop. And very important to mention, have a rolling pin ready for this process. Begin by dusting your rolling pin very, very lightly, and this will allow for you to keep away any chances of you having the dough stick to your board. And I'm just going to allow that to sit over a piece of cloth. Remember, this will actually limit it from sliding over the counter. And we begin the process very, very simply by dusting over the board. And very simply pat your hands, making sure that that also removes any bit of smell from your hands. Begin by patting down your dough and very, very simply begin to roll that out, turning 90 degrees anti-clockwise as you proceed. And of course turning over continuously. And very, very important to mention, always light as possible, dust as light as possible as you proceed. And this is basically to allow for you to not use too much at once. And proceed to do so right up until your chapati is about 10 to 15 centimeters in diameter. Proceed to dust lightly once more, turning over continuously, and proceed to do the same, always of course making sure that your rolling pin actually touches the edges of your dough. And this is a particularly good checkpoint to make sure that your tortilla wrap is evenly rolled out. Now we're coming up to almost the size that we're looking for. And one particular beautiful thing about using such a board, it actually allows for you to also keep your shape intact. So for those of you who may actually be wondering how to always get a nice beautiful round chapati, one particular technique you can use is using a round board. Another simple technique you can do if you don't have one of this, probably roll out your dough and using a knife or a pizza cutter you can lay a round plate right over the top, and going right around it will give you a nice more even shape. Now just to finish that off, as you can see, nice big size. So this has now given us about 13 centimeters in radius, which is a very, very good size. But very importantly for this recipe, you are looking for a much thinner, a more even consistent roll. So be sure to make sure to roll that as thin as possible. And all you need to do at this stage is proceed to heat a pan, and we're going to allow that to cook very, very gently. So we're going to proceed to do the same thing for the rest of our dough. Of course, taking your time to do so a little bit in advance, or you can actually be able to do it very, very light, very, very easily, especially if you're working quite quick. They should be able to take you anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes to complete. Very important to always make sure to pay attention to your mangoes that are still cooking. So this is now pretty much almost dried up completely, and you can be able to see the caramel color that's right around the edges. You can at this stage proceed to mix that through. And this will actually easily mash as you proceed to mix. So you can proceed to now press everything onto the pan. And of course you should be doing this at very, very low heat. And you can turn down your heat completely at this stage. And while continuously mixing, remember this will allow for it to cool off a little faster. Proceed to also press down onto your mango, making sure that all of your mango bits are completely pureed down and your mixture is nice and consistent. And all we will do at this stage is proceed to move that into a bowl and allow that to cool off until the time we'll be serving. And that you can allow to rest right over your countertop, or you can also throw it in the refrigerator. But I particularly like to leave it out in the open, because it will allow for it to cool off a little more evenly, and it will also give you ingredients a bit more time to blend in together with the flavors. And now while we continue to roll this out and proceed to start our first process of cooking, we'll of course take you into the first break of the show. And we will catch you in a very, very little while. We will also be coming back to show you the last and final bit of how to finish this off. And we'll also proceed to go into the oven and, of course, finish the last and final part of the cooking. But before we do so, we will catch you after a short break. Welcome back, viewers. For those of you who were with us just before we took the break, we were working on some tortillas. Very, very simple substitute from chapati. Something I could mention with tortilla, very, very common, especially when making wraps. And on this particular episode, I'm going to be focusing on just that. Remember, tortillas are particularly a good family to relate to chapatis, in that they look very much similar in appearance, but very, very different in preparation and cooking. Now, what happens with the dough, and in most times, especially if you're working with either hot or cold mixture, very, very similar technique also applies, especially when doing chapatis. Remember, you can also be able to make chapatis with some cold water, especially if you're going to be making something somewhat similar to a tortilla wrap or a pita bread. But if, of course, you are going to be making chapatis, you may also want to reheat your water. Remember, the aid behind heating, or rather using a hot liquid, will actually allow for you to get a nice, more soft, more easily to a more easier to use consistency of your dough. And it will, of course, also allow for you to cook a little longer on the pan. But especially if you're working with the cold mixture dough, very important to mention, it will cook a little faster. It will also color a little faster. And for the fact that you're also using very, very little oil compared to when you're using a hot mixture, it will also be a very, very different outlook at the end of it. So this is particularly why we chose to use the tortilla version of the recipe. But you can, of course, also achieve the same by using some regular chapatis, maybe chapatis that you have left over. They will also dry up nice and easy in the oven, just as we will see with this particular recipe. So just to finish this off, very, very simple technique, as I mentioned a little earlier. All it requires is very, very little oil, especially while cooking. Remember, you will actually be brushing this with a bit of oil before they go into the oven. And we'll allow that last piece to cook to its finish. And as I was mentioning as well, you can be able to see the nice, beautiful color. You will actually be able to notice a bit of some pockets in there. Very, very good sign to check for, especially when working with tortillas or chapatis. Now this we're going to be throwing into the oven very, very briefly. But before we do, I'm going to begin by brushing them in a bit of oil. So to a small bowl or plate, add about a tablespoon of some oil, season with some salt, and proceed to add your chopped coriander. And we're going to be brushing, so you can actually use a brush to infuse that very, very quickly. And you can add a little bit of oil if the mixture is still too chunky. So this should actually be very, very runny at this stage. So you can, of course, calibrate that to 2 tablespoons and not 1. And now very simply onto the tortilla. You can easily turn that as soon as it starts to puff up. It's always a nice, beautiful point to check on, especially if you're going to be doing the fast cooking on a hot pan. So it will actually always rise from the sides. Remember, it's always a tortilla wrap or a chapati will cook from the outside in. So you will always, on most occasions, realize that it will actually rise from the sides and, of course, continue to rise towards the center. Now, as we finish off that last piece, just going to give that a look. And once that's ready, going to remove that from the heat, and you can turn off your heat completely. Once that's done, I will also mention at this point, you will of course need a preheated oven for this recipe. You can of course do so without an oven, but it will also be a bit of a challenge. So you may actually want to calibrate the liquid in your mixture. Of course, you will actually use much little liquid as compared to this recipe, especially if you're going to be drying them off on the pan. But if you're going to be doing them in the oven, of course, make sure to have just a little bit of moisture in your dough, and this will allow for a nice, more even browning and, of course, a drying process. So we're going to begin by grabbing some 2 pieces. And I'm just going to begin by laying those on the chopping board. And all you're going to do at this stage is begin to brush over your coriander oil. And this will of course do 2 things. It gives it a nice beautiful color, also infuses a nice beautiful flavor. And we're going to be just brushing the one top side of the tortillas. So do the same thing for the second piece. Making sure of course to add as much of the coriander as possible. And of course always brush towards the edges, because these are particularly areas that are easy to forget. And you can easily now tilt the bowl and pretty much try and scoop out all the coriander that's left over, of course, while being very vigilant to make sure you don't add too much oil at this stage. Simple as that. Once that is complete, we are going to be throwing this in the oven, but before we do so, begin by slicing your tortilla wrap lengthways into some thin strips of about 1 inch in thickness. And as I'd mentioned, very, very easy tool to use. You can be able to purchase this similar item at your regular retail stores. And you can, of course, also use a knife if you can be able to find one. So very simply, we're just going to scatter those around our baking tray. No particular fashion whatsoever. They are just going to dry. They are just going to dry off. So we're just going to slice the second piece similar to the first. And as I'd mentioned, if you're looking for a nice, different alternative to giving or serving a starter, this is a particularly good one. You can, of course, always serve this nice and crispy on their own. You can also season with many, many more alternative ingredients, such as some black pepper. You can also use some spice if you're looking for a bit of more flavor. And you can also use a bit of some chili powder if you're looking for some extra heat. Now this will pretty much now cook in the oven undisturbed. We're going to slide that in there. allowing that to cook at about 200 degrees. Remember, this is basically just a drying process. They will actually absorb all that oil and really get to that crispy stage that we're looking for. And we'll of course take you to the last and final part, which is the plating. But before we do so, we'll allow you one more chance to freshen up, and we'll catch you after a short break. Welcome back, viewers. If you're just tuning in, remember you can always recap if you missed out on this episode through our YouTube page, which is BrandPlus TV Kenya, and you can always also air your comments, queries, or any particular suggestions through our Facebook page, that's BrandPlus TV Kenya. And now, just to take you to the last and final part of the show, which is our plating, I'll begin by taking this out of the oven. And those are now beautifully browned and also very, very crispy. You can be able to see that by lifting them. They should actually be almost a tiny bit crispy at the stage they come out of the oven. But remember, allowing them to cool off will also allow for them to get more crispier. So be sure to always make sure to take them off slightly a little earlier than time. So this of course went in for about 6 to 7 minutes. I would recommend making it about 5 to 6. And of course allowing for the extra 2 minutes for your chapati or your tortilla strips to pretty much cool off on your baking tray, and this will allow for you to get the just to get the right amount of crisp to it. Now, to begin our process of plating onto this beautiful plate in front of us, I'll of course begin by plating our chutney, and as you can see, it's got a nice beautiful consistency to it. Of course, not very sweet, not very salty, but it will actually go quite well with your chapati chips. Right, once that's done, you can proceed to move that onto the plate, and very, very simply begin by using a pair of tongs. You can of course proceed to begin your plating, and very simply go right around the bowl at the center and pretty much build your stack right around it, and that will also of course look a little more appetizing to your guests or to your kids. And just proceed to do so right up until you've got a nice beautiful stack right around the plate. And that is as easy as done. Now, just some tips I could also share with you. Remember, chapati does come in a very, very big array of recipes. You have of course chapatis that of course call for some hot water on the mixture. Some will of course allow for some cold water depending on what you're going to be using your base for. But one particular technique that you will find very, very common is the fact that chapati will always call for a bit of some flour, a bit of some oil, and lastly a bit of some salt. On rare occasions, you will of course have some butter added to that, which will of course give you some paratha. And if of course you're not using any butter or oil, you can also be able to get some beautiful different kinds of consistencies to it. For instance, wraps, which are particularly used for wrapping all kinds of dishes, chicken or vegetable. Now, for this particular recipe, we of course called it chapati crisps because of the fact that it does look like chapati on the plate. I will also remind you that you can of course use chapatis that are left over in your refrigerator. A simple, easy bit of brushing over the top, drying them off on a hot pan or even in the oven will allow for you to get just the same consistency right through. And of course, for those of you who are not big fans of using chilies, you can of course always try out the bullet chili that's a little less hot. But if you are, of course, looking for that crisp kick of heat, you can, of course, always alternate that for some green chilies, and of course that will, of course, bring up quite a bit of heat to the dish. But for this dish, for this particular stage, we're right about done with it. I will, of course, continue to recommend that you do check out our Facebook page. Remember, we're always looking forward to hear back from you. And you can, of course, also check out our YouTube page, which of course you will be able to recap on this and many other episodes that you may have missed out on. But for now, we will bid you farewell, wishing you a lovely evening with you and your family. And until the next episode, God bless you and bye-bye.